Thank you, everyone, for waking up. Thanks to organizers for organizing and inviting. I'll talk a little bit about the methodology that powers some of the foundational models and some of the models that we're also developing with an eye towards dynamics of catalysis. Because, when you make catalysts, well, first you have to make them and know how they're made, how they work, and how they degrade. So all of that is time evolution, right? So for that, we try to develop methods for simulating dynamics. Okay, so first I want to thank the amazing group that develops all the software that I'll mention briefly, that powers our simulations, and of course the funding sources. And the idea on the high level, what we want to do is essentially describe catalysts and heterogeneous systems in general of very high complexity for which we need fast simulations and high accuracy at the same time. So we use machine learning. I wouldn't call it AI, but we use machine learning to essentially compress information from more expensive models into cheaper models that still retain the same accuracy. For instance, I'll talk about this effort on machine learning force fields that are essentially close to accuracy of DFT, but much faster. And I'll talk about some new DFT models that are close to accuracy than some of the wave function methods, but also much faster. And of course, the vision is to bring everything together to have very fast and very accurate models that can then allow us to simulate catalytic systems and their degradation and their performance. Okay, so we work on developing models that take as an input the atomic structure and encode that structure into a feature that machine learning models can understand and use it for learning, and then predict energies and atomic forces that can then power molecular dynamics simulations. And anything that sort of you could do with DFT calculations, you should be able to do then with these kind of force fields. And these are some of the different softwares that we've developed. I very quickly mentioned how they work and then go from there. Okay, so let's see. First, I wanted to briefly mention this class of equivariant neural networks that are getting more and more popular because they somehow magically are able to learn with little data and learn also much more accurately than previous generation of models that were not equivariant. What equivariance means essentially is you have a rich geometric directional information encoded in a neural network. And so it knows more about the environment of every atom in order to predict forces and energies on those atoms. And so this is basically illustrated here as a message passing kind of formalism that passes geometric tensor messages between atoms, and that way you can encode many-body information. You can also pass many-body messages between atoms. This was an idea proposed by Simon Watzner a while back, and you can sort of marry this kind of NQUIP architecture with this many-body formalism of atomic cluster expansion, and this is what became MACE after a collaboration with Gabor-Jani. And so these equivariant models are really leading the accuracy currently still in terms of molecular benchmarks on average, in terms of what the force errors are on very large data sets, but also they are somehow much more stable in molecular dynamics. And this is critical when you're simulating for a long time something that reacts rarely. You don't want the simulation to blow up. You don't want those errors to come and spoil everything. So this gives us also the ability to do simulations that are meaningful and long and accurate at the same time. And finally, foundation models. So this is sort of a benchmark website of different foundation models. What I want to highlight, and this is an exercise of trying to train a model that is able to predict, let's say, formation energies of any inorganic crystal by seeing pretty much all inorganic crystals in a database. So this is as wide as you can think of an inorganic space. We don't develop these models, but the first model that came up sort of on the leader rank using this equivariant architecture was Genome, that was from Google DeepMind last December, I believe. There was MACE, which is, as I explained, this sort of combination of NQUIP and ACE, and then recently 7net is another model. So all of these models are based on this equivariant architecture. So that's basically encouraging, telling us that these models can learn a wide range of inorganic structures and their corresponding energies. These models, unfortunately, are difficult to scale to large simulations. And what we want is fast and big, right? So these message passing networks have an unfortunate kind of scaling limitation because you have to pass messages between atoms. And as a result, if you want the model to be accurate, you need lots of these messages, and it's hard to parallelize in a computer. So we've developed an alternative method that is also equivariant and has just the same sort of accuracy advantages, but is strictly local in the sense that you can capture information about the environment of an atom without having this sort of message propagation, and that allows you to scale to very large simulation sizes, which is, again, very important for studying realistic heterogeneous systems. So as an example of, again, sort of going in this direction of training general models, we spent about a week on one GPU to train this Allegro model on the entire SPICE data set, which is a bunch of proteins and water, and try to deploy it on actual human proteins, just as an example of a complex system, not catalytic, but nonetheless going up to 100 million atoms in size and capturing dynamics on about 5,000 GPUs that we got access to. And this was an exercise to show that these equivariant models can be scalable and fast and do realistic complex systems. In addition, you need to know how to construct training sets, right? So models are not enough. You need data. Data is essentially supposed to describe all the complexity of reactions and rare events. And we're developing tools for doing that using Gaussian process regression. This is an approach that is not based on neural networks. It's based on atomic cluster expansion, sort of this descriptor of geometry that is fed into this Bayesian model that is able to predict not only the forces and energies of atomic species, but also uncertainty on these predictions. So this is a model that knows when it doesn't know something, right? So when you feed it new information to predict, it may complain and say, my uncertainty is too high, and automatically call a DFT calculation, augment the data set on the fly. And this is an example in heterogeneous catalysis. Again, this is a system-specific model, not a foundational one, but one system at a time that we are demonstrating how you can essentially step back, not give it any information to begin with about how a catalyst works, and it will figure out what it needs on the fly, get all the information from quantum mechanics, and eventually learn what is happening when you say activate hydrogen on platinum metal. So in this case, you just start with a hydrogen gas platinum slab and let it go. And every time a red atom appears, that means it's learning something from DFT, and then eventually stops learning because it has seen everything it needs to know. About a few hundred DFT calls is what it needs to learn the hydrogen-platinum interaction. And then we can deploy it in larger scale and count how many reactions happen. So it's basically a digital twin of a catalytic system, essentially with a gas, with a slab running, and then you can discover what the mechanisms are and calculate as a function of temperature what the rates are and compare with experiment to see that you've captured essentially the kinetics of this particular system. Okay, so the activation energy matches experimental observations on HD exchange. And we can also increase the scale of these models and test the scalability and go up to, in this case, a trillion atoms, I should say, on 65,000 GPUs. Again, this is maybe a not so relevant exercise for actual catalysis, but it shows you that you can do large-scale simulations, hunting for maybe those rare events that you don't see if you do a smaller simulation. So if you're thinking about sort of discovering catalytic reaction mechanisms, such simulations could be useful. Okay, so as a realistic example of how to make catalysts, for instance, this is a demonstration of a simulation that is showing how when palladium is scattered, is sputtered on silver substrate, how the catalyst forms. This bimetallic catalyst with some sort of magic combination of selectivity and reactivity for hydrogenation of alkynes, for instance. This mixture 50-50 is formed in about 2 microseconds in our simulation and perfectly replicates what STM pictures show, which would take much longer, of course. And you see this etching effect of the silver substrate, this enlargement of the catalyst, this mixing to make a 50-50 top layer and all of that. So this shows you how you can simulate deformation. You can also simulate surface restructuring, so reconstruction of ideal surfaces, this well-known herringbone pattern in Gold 111. We can also simulate essentially from scratch without telling the model how surfaces should reconstruct. It figures it out, and also finds these spinodal decomposition patterns with higher amount of add atoms that were also apparently previously observed by Ertl. And what's important is you can study degradation, right? So you can study, for instance, a mixture of palladium and gold and look at how hydrogen dissociates and migrates and then recombines on different sites in a mixed 50-50 or 30-70 or 20-80 mixture kind of palladium and gold, and see that the sizes of the ensembles matter for reactivity, and that these monomers and dimers are the most active sites. You can actually see that from dynamics itself, but you can also see that if you heat this catalyst during annealing conditions, the reactivity that we observe actually stops. And this is explained by noticing that there's a sort of submergence of palladium and there's a subsurface, and you see the sort of degradation happening, this deactivation. And of course, you can also then ask, how do you rejuvenate this catalyst, and what kind of gases to expose to the catalyst to make palladium come back up. But this is a more complicated question. Okay. So we also done a lot of work on nanoparticles in collaboration with Anatoly Frenkel, trying to combine X-ray spectroscopy with molecular dynamics to try to understand what the active sites are and what the restructuring phenomena are when you expose nanoparticles to hydrogen. They reshape, and even more so when you expose them to carbon monoxide. So you can sort of completely forget about the ideal facets in real catalysts when they're interacting with strong adsorbents. Finally, just in a few minutes, I want to describe the most foundational of foundational models that we unfortunately still don't have, and this is DFT. DFT is what we base all these machine learning force fields on, but it has a poor record of predicting at the same time bulk properties and adsorption energies, and of course reaction barriers. So in some lucky cases, like platinum and hydrogen I showed, this is working okay, but in many cases it doesn't. Like you can see the adsorption energy of CO and rhodium, for instance, is very poorly predicted. So you need more expensive methods that sometimes are very difficult to scale, like hybrid level DFT, or even higher level quantum chemical methods, which unfortunately we still don't have for catalysis. And this is probably the biggest open and difficult question in heterogeneous catalysis. And so we've been developing machine learning models for improving DFT by asking a question, well, if we have this expensive objects that we need to compute in hybrid calculations, this exchange energy of electrons, how can we come up with a surrogate model that is much cheaper but still has almost the same accuracy so that we can do these expensive DFT calculations on large realistic systems? So, for instance, you can say, okay, I can feed in some descriptors of electronic density and orbitals into a machine learning model, enforcing it to satisfy exact scaling rules and predict the exchange energy that you then use in hybrid DFT calculations, if you're familiar with that. And so what we find is that if we train this method on a wide range of molecules and solids, we can actually get within quantum chemical accuracy of the hybrid calculation. So this is getting within about 1 kcal per mole with this non-local meta GGA machine learning model that we call CIDR. And on both molecular and solid state, it's showing encouraging ability to get close to the higher level method, which is exact exchange, this expensive calculation in terms of orbitals. So just wanted to show you that there's progress in this direction. And what you get is also better prediction of band gaps, which is important for electrocatalysis. And you could predict properties of defects much better than with semi-local DFT functionals. So in this case, this is showing all sorts of defects in silicon in comparison with experiment on charge transition levels for these defects. And what I wanted to mention is that the cost of these calculations using CIDR functionals is essentially the same as semi-local functionals, but it gets you accuracies of exact exchange calculations or close to that. So this is sort of the direction we're going, and the next step is to try to understand, of course, solvated electrons in water and sort of polaronic effects that may be also important for heterogeneous catalysis if you're dealing with oxidation state changes in Syria, for instance, in water gas shift reactions and so forth. So you need also much, much better description of electronic states to get anywhere with a description of those systems. And there's some progress in this direction as well. And the next step would be to train an exchange correlation functional, which would be the sort of the foundation of the foundational models to come when we develop force fields based on that. So with that, I'll stop and thank you and take any questions.
So instead of running brute force MD, what about sampling the transition states?
Yeah, so the advantage of having a cheap energy model is that you can actually accelerate significantly the transition state search step. Right. So right now, what we have done is sort of brute force MD, if you will. We've also played around with discovery of collective variables based on MD that you can use for enhanced sampling, and then sort of sample the free energy barriers. You could also use the ability to differentiate these models to power, let's say, NAB. Non-elastic band or dimer methods or any sort of transition state search methods. So the same energy model that runs MD can be used for those tasks as well. They unfortunately require a lot of sort of human input to get started. Oh, yeah.
Thanks for the great talk. So for a lot of heterogeneous catalyst questions, we're looking at modeling the kind of interactions between like molecules and the surface, right? So does plane wave-based functional be good enough for this kind of cases, or do you need more like advanced functionals for this?
That's a very good question. I think one of the most important questions is which functional or maybe which quantum chemical method is necessary to accurately model adsorption and reaction on surfaces. And if you ask different people, some might say RPA is needed. Some people might say, HSC or like some hybrid functional is needed. Some folks are doing quantum Monte Carlo simulations to get actually within reasonable agreement to experiment for some of these, adsorption calculations. Maybe no simple functional does the job. I certainly don't have an answer, but this is the most important question.
Questions?
So really nice talk. So you talk about the sort of bridge the size in this type of simulations. So how about what do you see the challenge to bridge the gap maybe to the real diversity in catalysis? You have many elements in the environment, not the system side. I can understand once you learn local environment, you can extend to model size. But that other type of diversity, what should we do to overcome those type of a gap?
That's also a very good question. You definitely want a model that you can start with, like, some sort of a pre-trained model, and then fine-tune it with whatever the best sort of DFT functional or the best quantum chemical method in each case separately probably will be necessary, right? And then the diversity is a question of, knowing what actually structures you have in the catalyst. And unfortunately, I think the answer is there. We need better characterization, better ways of understanding what the active sites are, what their structures, what's happening microscopically, because, diversity in composition space and in structure space are both important. And plus there's all sorts of dynamics, like you think you know what a catalyst is, but actually can change within microseconds and be a very different structure. So for instance, what I'm not showing here, like, you start with some sort of one mixture of two elements, you anneal it, and it's already a very different mixture. So there's a lot of questions, but I think to make progress in computation, I would say the most important thing is for us to get closer to experimental characterization, and then our calculations will be much more targeted.
It reminds me that tomorrow we have two panel discussions. The first one is on current barriers, the second on future opportunities. And you touched on both of these points of in these questions. So like throughout today, think about what we're going to talk about tomorrow of what are the current barriers to making progress and then opportunities. So one final question.
Great. Maybe I didn't quite catch it, but I would like to ask about exchange model that you showed. That's predicting that just the exchange, touching from exchange entity, right? Am I correct in assuming that you're still using like 1/4, 3/4 mixing with the density functional exchange, or?
That's exactly right. So like in that equation up there, it's a drop-in for the expensive part of the hybrid calculation, which is the exact exchange, which in plane waves would be rather costly. Okay, so it will not do better than, let's say, PB0 if you're using it with a PB correlation.
Yeah.
But I mean, what we're doing now is also training correlation, right? So this is an exercise to see whether non-local functional can be learned in principle, and exchange provides a nice practice problem because we know exactly the answer. We can compute it. Yeah.
Why not the whole exchange, as in the PB and the exchange, rather than just the Hartree function?
Oh, because the PB exchange is, we can just write it down.
Yeah.
So I mean, yeah.
But there's a mixing factor which is structure dependent, right?
Yeah, the mixing factor is something that we at least understand because, this is how hybrids are used, right? I mean, you adjust the mixing factor depending on maybe on the structure or something like that. If you learn just one model for the entire piece here, then you don't have that flexibility necessarily, Yeah. But I mean, the real target here is not necessarily just the exchange, it's the entire functional. And if you want to capture sort of all sorts of cancellation of errors or whatever, like this sort of combined effects, because splitting exchange and correlation is very arbitrary, right? So it doesn't make sense to put a lot of effort on just getting the exchange part. It's this whole exchange correlation that we really need to learn. Yeah.
All right, let's thank Boris again.
Thank you.